here I'm getting ready to do the ignition, and since this I have good ignitions, like I have a pointed ignition that's perfectly fine, but for this saw I'm not going to use a good ignition because if it does get hot and overheat for whatever reason, then it could fry the ignition, so I don't want to ruin a good one. These coils, these are all from failed ignitions, but I think they might still be good. You can see I've tried using them. Some of them I had problems with, and I think all these I considered them all fried and not working, but then I went and I thought they were fried from being overheated, but then I was buying these, and I picked one, just randomly picked one of these in my junk coil box, and on the last experimental saw I used one, and I just bought I bought this SIG 1. It's a SIG 1 ignition module. I was using these Nova 2s, and I think what was happening was I was using hot glue to glue them onto the saw, because I put them in I put them where the heat from the crankcase or cylinder wouldn't affect them, but I think the hot glue was messing them up, and they're just not tolerant to heat, and so I bought this SIG 1 and put it on the last one, and it works great. I mean, the ignition works great now on that, and it was one of these that I thought was failed, so I'm going to try another one of these, and I'm not going to buy these. These have one for a ground, one terminal for the main wire, and then the other one for a ground. This one just has a main one. It's self-grounding, but in order to make it self-grounding, I'd have to have it on the crankcase somewhere, and I don't want it on the crankcase because I don't want it to get hot. So I was thinking about maybe, a lot of the times I'll put it on this piece that goes here. I'll put it right in there, and I was thinking about just running a ground wire down to one of these bolts, and I'll put it through that hole, and I was thinking of using a rivet, just like a pop rivet, because I don't want, and I'll also drill a couple holes there and put a zip tie to hold it, but I don't want to use hot glue, and I could use like JB Weld or something, but I'll zip tie it and maybe use a pop rivet. I'm not sure if I'll be able to, like, if I use a pop rivet, I'd have to drill another hole for the wire and all that, but that's no big deal. Actually, yeah, the ground wire, and I'd need a hole for the switch wire. But I'm going to use this SIG 1. The last one I bought works, and I actually bought two because I have an old steel 020 that I think the ignition on it is dying, so I'm going to try one of them on it. So that's that, and this is like I'm calling it a stator plate. This was to an old earlier SEM ignition, and I think these are the least desirable of the different varieties that Steel used on the series. And you can see I tried chipping away to see if there's any way I could fix it, and that's just solid stuff there. It wasn't worth it to me. But I think this is the same specifications as a regular, like I compared it with another, like a Bosch electronic, and also a points ignition, and like the holes seem to line up and everything. So I'm going to experimentally, I'm going to try this, one of these coils, they'll go on there, and then this'll run to, it'll join to here, and then this will be grounded to the crankcase, and then this will also go to the switch, and I forget how it all goes now. I'll figure it out when I get there. But then the switch also, I usually ground it to the crankcase also. I think they need to be grounded. I don't use the OEM switches for these either because they fail. I buy toggle switches and they work great. The ones I've been buying, I haven't had one fail yet. But that's what. And then this is a Bosch electronic ignition flywheel, and it like using this with this setup, it's actually better to use like this one is a points ignition flywheel, I believe. Yeah, that's the part number for a points ignition flywheel. It would work with this if I keep the flywheel key in it. I was thinking about using that because this one, some of the pole shoes fell off and I glued them back on, so I don't know if it's going to hold up, but hopefully it does. I don't want to use it on a good ignition because I glued them back on. I think a lot of people have done that and didn't have any problems. This one, they never fell off, and you know, what happens sometimes is if it's left on and it sits in an area where there's moisture, then these will kind of rust and stick to the ignition, the ignition coil, and then when you pull it off with your flywheel puller, it'll pull off the pole shoes, and of course the corrosion will help that out. But these weren't that bad. They just fell off. I don't know why. I mean, I got this in a box of parts for really cheap off eBay, and the flywheel was in it, and these shoes were just sitting in the box too, and I just glued them back on, and I've used it and it works perfectly fine. Whether they'll stay on or not, I don't know. But that's what I'm about to do to test my ignition, to see if I can get a good ignition that should start the saw. If it doesn't work first time, I'm going to switch out this because I don't know if this is a good one to use for it. If it still doesn't work, I'll just go through and try each one of these. The flywheels, I know they're good. I'm pretty sure I've used both of them before. This is pretty new stuff here. That one's got a little funny thing on it, but there's nothing that can really go wrong with that. I know the switch is good that I'm going to use. It's on another gas tank right now, but I'll get that together and see if I can get some spark. Okay, now I tried using the points flywheel, but it wouldn't turn over because it kept scraping on the ignition coil, so it would turn over halfway, then two of the pole shoes would rub on that, so I couldn't do that. And that would have been, I left the flywheel key in, that would have worked the way it was, if it works. And so that didn't work, so I'm trying this. This is to a Bosch electronic ignition, and the location of the pole shoes related to the keyway is slightly different, so I have to change the ignition timing. I just wanted to show that. And so what I'm doing is this, I won't be able to see the keyway when this is on, so I'm marking where it is. And I can see the keyway in here. It's right there. So when I put this on, I want to line up the left side of this keyway to the right side of that. This is my piston stop. I used a plastic one. This did have a hard plastic that was kind of shaped, kind of like that. and they break the first time you use them. So I drilled a hole in the end, and this is trimmer string that I used some plastic weld type or plastic epoxy type glue and glued that in. That's been working really good. So I'm just going to put it just so the left side of the flywheel keyway is about where the right side is on the crankshaft keyway. Now, I have to tighten it down. That's pretty good. You can, I have stripped these nuts before, so, and that's, now the flywheel is torqued down on there. I'm just going to take this nut off, and the flywheel, I'd have to use a puller at this point to take it back off. I'm just going to check and make sure that didn't move. Still good. And if it's advanced too far, you'll know it, because when you go to pull on the starter, and you pull this and it fires, it'll rip the starter handle right out of your hand. That's what happened if I turned it counterclockwise a little too far. That's what would happen. If you don't turn it far enough, it'll just be hard to start. And there's a little bit of a range that's where it'll start. Like if you're I go by a flywheel key width, so if you're right at a flywheel key width, it'll start. If you're a quarter over, it starts to snap. If you're a quarter under, it starts to get hard to stop, or to start. So that's kind of the guide. I just go right in the middle. Some people, I guess you can, if you put your ignition timing in a certain spot, some people say they run better. I don't know. I just put it where it works, and they always run pretty good. I can hear it scraping a tiny bit, but it turns, the other one would just stop and I'd have to force it. Let's see if it has any spark. know, I used a wire nut on this part, and that could be the problem. But I think it's actually the stator plate, because it's to a older SEM ignition, and it might just be a little off. So I'm gonna have to change that out and see if I can get spark. Okay, I found a problem, and it wasn't the stator plate. It was when I put the coil onto the stator plate, it let's see if I can find one. Well, this is a little bit different coil, but basically when it went on, that stator plate was shaped differently. The ignition was. Just the wire here got squished in between it, and it exposed the metal, and it was shorting out. And I just put some electrical tape on it just to see if it would have spark. It doesn't have a super strong spark, and it's kind of hard to pull over because this is a friction style. First of all, this is a friction style starter, which they work great when they're in good shape. This one's could probably be cleaned up and stuff like that. And then I got I put like a lot more castor oil in the cylinder than I normally would put. I just like gooped it all in because I want to have good compression when I start, so I went a little overboard on that. So it's a little hard to pull over, but let's see if we can show some spark here. It's kind of weak, but with a good pull it gets stronger. A really strong ignition, you wouldn't really need too strong of a pull to get a decent spark. But it sparks, and hopefully it'll fire.